Good afternoon, and welcome to Everybody, the podcast which shares stories that highlight people in life that make the world an interesting place, which ultimately ties us all together in unique and wonderful ways. And who am I, you might ask? I would be the head wrap socialite, wife, mom, micro influencer in the fashion and etiquette world. But on this podcast, I will be introducing you to some people who I've had the opportunity to meet along my journey, who have helped enrich me in my life in beautiful ways, and who I hope will do the same in yours. For those who witness the erosion of a loved one's mind, the agony is immeasurable. The journey of Alzheimer's and dementia is one that demands our attention, our empathetic hearts, and our unwavering commitment to find a cure. For in the face of this affliction, we are often reminded of the fragility and beauty of our own memories and the preciousness of each moment we are given. Good afternoon, and welcome to another episode of Everybody. Today's special guest is Dr. Cliff Jack, who is a world-renowned leader in the field of dementia and Alzheimer's research. Known for his pioneering work in understanding and treating these devastating conditions. With decades of experience in neuroscience and clinical research, Dr. Jack has become a leading authority on the brain and its functions, particularly in the areas of memory and cognitive impairment. Despite his busy schedule, Dr. Jack remains committed to improving the lives of those affected by dementia and Alzheimer's, both through his research and his advocacy work. His contributions to this field have been recognized worldwide, and he continues to be a leading voice in the fight against these devastating conditions. But I will tell you that Dr. Jack's interests and talents go way beyond the research area. He is also an accomplished musician. Thank you, Dr. Cliff Jack, for agreeing to be on this podcast. Knowing you for several years, I appreciate the person that you are and what you bring to this world in which we live. Dr. Jack, can you tell the listeners a little bit about who you are?
Sure. For the listeners, I'll just say that by way of introduction, Jean and I have known each other for, like she said, several years. And the way we came to know each other is we both attend the exercise class. She goes 5 days a week, which is more than I can say for myself. We both attend this exercise class, and we've gotten to know, each other through that mechanism. And I think as the conversation winds on, listeners will understand the importance of exercise as one of the, pillars of maintaining good health as you age. So I am someone who practices what they preach. A little bit about myself. I was trained as a neuroradiologist. What does that mean? It's someone who specializes in imaging the brain and the spinal cord. And I did my fellowship at Mayo Clinic in clinical neuroradiology, but very early on, even when I was a fellow, my interest turned not away from clinical practice, but more towards research. And I came on the staff at Mayo Clinic as a practicing neuroradiologist. As time went on, I became more and more interested in research, developed a research program, and more of my time then was spent devoted to research as opposed to clinical practice for several decades. My professional life has focused entirely on research. My initial research interests were in epilepsy. And one of the things that we worked out was, along with my colleagues in neurology area of epilepsy, surgical epilepsy, was how to measure parts of the brain that were involved in seizure disorders very commonly and were targets for surgical removal. So the first major area of research that I started working on when I did my fellowship, even before I came fully on the staff at Mayo, was measuring a part of the brain called the hippocampus for epilepsy surgery planning. this has nothing to do with Alzheimer's disease, but it turns out that this is an area of the brain very commonly involved as the focus for seizures that can be treated with surgical removal. Being able to measure this with MRI, quantitative measures of MRI, turned out to be very useful for epilepsy surgery planning. This had nothing to do with dementia, but as it turns out, measuring the hippocampus is also useful for Alzheimer's disease because the hippocampus is an area of the brain where one of the two main pathologies that define Alzheimer's disease begins. So just by chance, the techniques that I had worked out for epilepsy, measuring the volume of the hippocampus with MRI, turned out to be very applicable to the Alzheimer's field. And so that's how I got into Alzheimer's research.
Wow.
And so obviously I started out with the research program, it was just me and kind of by myself, but getting successive national grants from the National Institutes of Health have built up the research program. I don't even know how many people we have now, but 30, 40, 50, something like that. People who used to be my trainees, my fellows, are now on staff at Mayo. Research programs under general umbrella for our lab. So the lab has grown quite big, and we've expanded well beyond measuring the hippocampus. So we now examine the brain with all sorts of different modalities, functional MRI, which people may have heard about, but other modalities, diffusion MRI, et cetera, but also PET imaging. So there's amyloid PET, tau PET. We look at genetics, we look at clinical outcomes, we look at neuropathology. So really all facets of aging and dementia that are involved in modern clinical research. And again, the program has grown so that we're not just limited to Alzheimer's disease, but we also look at other forms of dementia that go beyond Alzheimer's disease. So that's kind of a scope of the whole research program. And like I said, we have at this point programs grown quite large with not just me as a primary investigator, but other people who were my trainees and now have their own research programs. So that's kind of where things stand. But as busy as we are in the lab, always make time for exercise. That's where I see Trina.
Cliff is the consummate. He will downplay his abilities, but Cliff is there just as much as I am. I want to ask you though, Cliff, what exactly is dementia and Alzheimer's, and are these two things interchangeable?
Great question. This is something that there's a common misperception in the general public. To be honest with you, there's still misperceptions about this in medicine. So the terms are not interchangeable. So the term dementia refers to a level of severity of cognitive impairment. So if you imagine all older people, you can divide up level of cognitive performance and the degree of functional impairment that an individual experiences because of their cognitive abilities varies considerably. So you can divide up cognitive performance among older people, anyone really, but particularly older people, is to divide it into three levels: the normal cognitive performance, so cognitively unimpaired people. Then there are people who have a mild impairment, and then there are people who have a more severe impairment. And that more severe impairment is what is dementia. So severe impairment or dementia really just means that a person's cognitive abilities have declined so much, very often due to neurodegenerative diseases, but have declined so much that they're no longer able to manage their own personal affairs by themselves. They've lost their independence. So you can imagine in someone who has a neurodegenerative disorder, and we'll talk about neurodegenerative disorders in a second, but who has a neurodegenerative disease that slowly erodes their cognitive abilities. At the point where they can no longer drive, or they can no longer cook their own meals, or they can't balance their own checkbook anymore, etc. At that point, they've lost the ability to live independently. And it's at that point where doctors will say that person has dementia. So dementia just refers to a level of severity of cognitive impairment impairs an ability to function independently. Now, I mentioned that a common cause of dementia, the most common cause of dementia in older people, is neurodegenerative diseases. And neurodegenerative diseases and Alzheimer's disease are not synonymous. So Alzheimer's disease is one neurodegenerative disease. It's characterized by what probably most people, maybe everyone, is familiar with the terms plaques and tangles. So they're lesions found in the brain at autopsy, at neuropathology, that define Alzheimer's disease as one neurodegenerative disease. It's the most common one to cause cognitive impairment, but by no means the only one. Another common neurodegenerative disease is also something that a lot of people are familiar with. That is Lewy body disease. People are probably not so familiar with Lewy body disease, but Lewy body disease is the same pathology that causes Parkinson's disease. So people think of Parkinson's disease as a motor disorder, people who have problems with their gait or they have a resting tremor. But another manifestation of Lewy body disease, besides the Parkinsonian motor features, is a cognitive impairment. So Lewy body disease, like Alzheimer's disease, can produce cognitive impairment. It can produce dementia. There's another common neurodegenerative disease. Probably very few people would have heard of this. It's called TDP-43, also recently christened as late disease, but it is a common pathology that appears in the brains of elderly people. And finally, although it's not a neurodegenerative disease, a common cause of cognitive impairment in older people is strokes. Not certainly big strokes that people think of that cause paralysis and that sort of thing, but a very common, much more common manifestation of strokes is tiny little areas of infarction or stroke in the brain that over time accumulate and result in death of cells and cognitive impairment. Now, an important feature of all this is that the most common finding in the brains of people who have dementia, older people who come to autopsy and who have dementia, is a combination, some combination of the things I've just mentioned. So in an older person who has dementia and they come to autopsy, the most common findings are going to be Alzheimer's disease mixed with one or more of these other kinds of pathologies. So it's a little bit confusing, but the reality is that equating Alzheimer's disease and dementia is incorrect. They refer to two different things. Dementia is the level of cognitive impairment that an individual manifests, whereas Alzheimer's disease is one type of disease or one type of etiology that is responsible for dementia, usually in combination with other neurodegenerative disorders or strokes. That's the difference. And in a nutshell, that's the difference.
What are some of the latest developments in the field of dementia and Alzheimer's research? And I guess the other part of the question would be, how might these advancements impact the diagnoses and treatment of these conditions in the future?
The two biggest recent developments, and these are mostly for Alzheimer's disease, but not necessarily, and I'll describe that in a second. The two biggest areas of development are, one, fluid biomarkers, plasma biomarkers that are specific for the disease. And the second is disease-modifying treatments. So I'll take those. Let me just confine my comments right now to Alzheimer's disease, which again is just one of the several causes of cognitive impairment and dementia. I'll confine my comments to just Alzheimer's disease for the sake of clarity. So what do I mean by fluid biomarkers? So for years now, it has been possible to diagnose Alzheimer's disease in living people using either PET imaging or analysis of cerebral spinal fluid, which you have to get from a lumbar puncture, measuring the levels of certain proteins in the cerebral spinal fluid. So it's been possible to do that for years. The problem is that the cerebral spinal fluid route requires a lumbar puncture. So sticking a needle in the back, withdrawing some fluid from the spinal canal, and then analyzing that fluid. Now, that's not something that the average person is excited about having done. It's a lot more invasive than just having a blood draw, which you might get every year. So the problem with the cerebral spinal fluid diagnostic route has always been invasiveness. The second way to diagnose the disease has been with PET scanning, and PET scanning works fine. It's non-invasive. You get an injection in a vein and lay in a scanner. It's painless. The problem is it's very expensive. So until very recently, the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease as one of the causes of dementia could only be accomplished by means that were either invasive, more invasive than the average person is excited about getting, or really expensive.
Gotcha.
But that has all changed in the last couple of years. It's now possible using ultrasensitive assays, measuring concentrations of the right proteins in the blood, to take a simple blood sample, send it to a lab, and get a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease based on measuring the concentration of the right proteins in the blood. So that's a major, major breakthrough. It's now possible to diagnose Alzheimer's disease in someone, no matter where they live, what country they live. It's possible to take a blood sample, prepare it correctly, and send it off to a central lab and have a diagnosis made. A major advance that's going to revolutionize the diagnostics around Alzheimer's disease. The second major advance in this field has been the development of disease-modifying therapies. So what does that mean? So treatments for dementia have been around for a while. Everyone knows that there are pills that are given to people. Aricept's just a brand name for a class of drugs that affects the availability of one specific neurotransmitter. But heretofore, none of these treatments have actually changed the natural progression of the disease. So the natural progression of Alzheimer's disease, just like any neurodegenerative disease, is progressive death of cells in the brain, which proceeds inexorably over time. And none of the treatments for Alzheimer's disease heretofore have affected that at all. They result in a tiny improvement in symptoms for a limited period of time in some people, and that's about it. But very recently, clinical trials have shown that injections of what are called monoclonal antibodies, infusions of what are called monoclonal antibodies, that target one of the pathologies in the brain, the plaque pathology of Alzheimer's disease. This kind of treatment can, one, remove the amyloid plaques from the brain, and two, slow down the rate of cognitive decline in people with Alzheimer's disease. So those are the two big developments in the Alzheimer's field that have occurred in the last couple of years. And both of these, you can see how they work together. So now that it's possible to diagnose people accurately using these biomarkers, it's much easier to do clinical trials, and it will be much easier to find the right patients who are eligible for treatment. And it is the enhanced ability to do clinical trials that actually modify the progression of the disease that is something that will change the lives of patients. So both of those things are working hand in hand, and those are the two major areas of progress in Alzheimer's disease in recent years.
What I find really interesting is, I think I may have shared this with you before, but my grandmother suffered from early onset dementia. And I remember when I first noticed that something was different with my Nana. Each week we would always have these weekly phone calls, and it got to the point where, we were having these weekly phone calls, which we have done ever since I moved away uh, from home, went to college. I remember back in, I want to say it was 2012, and we were having this conversation. And at first, the conversation was normal. We talked, we laughed, we dished the dirt a little bit. But then after that, when we were done with our first part of the conversation, my Nana started to tell me from the very beginning what she had already told me.
Mm-hmm.
And at first, I didn't think anything of it. But as the months went by, it kept happening. So, we talk, same thing, catch up. And then sometimes she would catch herself in the midst of the conversation. And then she would ask me, did I already just say the same thing to you? And I think within, this 6 month period, she'd gone to the doctors because she's like, I don't feel right. There's something that's not right with myself. I can feel it. And I
Mm-hmm.
guess within that 6 months, she was diagnosed with early onset uh, dementia. And, after that, the family started to see the decline, happening. And it showed up first in the form of confusion, or she had a little language difficulty. And then she eventually wanted to just stay home.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the disease can be extremely difficult and scary for the person who's experiencing it. But I also think for the family members who eventually become the caregivers of this person, it becomes scary because we just want things to be the way that they were.
Mm-hmm.
And we try and look at that person or talk to that person as if things are still the same. And then for the caregivers, it shows up in the form of like frustration, or like, I just want you to be the way that you were before, but things are different. And I would just like to ask, what are some of the risk factors for developing dementia and Alzheimer's, and what can be done to reduce these risks? My grandmother has transitioned on. Of course, now, a few years out of it, I have all of these questions now that, you come in and out of the grief process. But that's my question, is what are some of the common risk factors for developing dementia and Alzheimer's, and what can be done to reduce these risks so that other people don't have to go down that same road?
Right. The story that you told about how old was she when you first noticed this?
I noticed that my grandma was very like hands-on,
Yeah.
always worked her whole entire life, but I noticed it when she was about late 70s.
Yeah. That's a very typical age. There is such a thing as early onset disease, but
Hmm.
late 70s, I mean, that's a very typical time for the onset of dementia.
Mm,
Really. And so dementia is, it's ultimately due to any one of these neurodegenerative diseases,
okay.
usually combinations of Alzheimer's disease plus one or more other things. But
Hmm.
the result is the disease kills neurons. Neurons are the
Mm,
cells that talk to each other in the brain. The
hmm.
disease kills neurons, and as neurons are progressively lost, a person's cognitive abilities progressively declines. And the key
Hmm.
word is progressive.
Yeah.
So it's a gradual. It's not something that happens overnight, but it's
Hmm.
something that happens over months to years.
Yeah.
But it is a progressive decline. There is no until there's no reversing
Yeah.
the loss that a person has experienced in terms of their cognitive abilities, because it's really due to death of neurons, death
Hmm.
of cells. And the key then trajectory that you described,
Hmm.
your grandma stopped in the middle of a conversation and she couldn't remember,
Hmm.
has she already talked about that?
Yeah.
Part of the brain that we've talked about, the hippocampus, right, is
Hmm.
involved in coding. It's an area of the brain that's involved very early on,
Hmm.
and it's the area of the brain that enables you to encode your experience into memory.
Mm,
So if the cells in that area of the brain die away, what happens is that your immediate experience, you've lost the ability to encode that immediate experience into memory.
Mm.
And as the disease progresses, other cognitive domains become more impaired. Language, spatial ability, you get lost. You might even get lost in your own house, etc. So it's a progressive loss of abilities. And, as we've said, once neurons die, the reality is they're not going to come back.
Yeah.
So even the treatments that I've talked about, they don't bring neurons back.
Okay.
They can slow the progression of the disease, slow it down, but they cannot recover. It's not like skin, where if you get a cut, it'll heal and you're as good as new. If you break your bone, it'll eventually heal and you're as good as new. The brain doesn't work that way. Once neurons die, they're gone. So it's very important to move on to your actual question. It's very important to understand the risk factors for dementia and do everything that you can in your daily life to try to preserve the health of your brain.
Okay.
There's certain things you can't do anything about. So what is those things are, one, genetics, and two, time. What do I mean by that? So there are, I won't go into a lot of detail about genetics, but there are very aggressive forms of Alzheimer's disease that manifest clinically in early life, 40s, 50s, but they're extremely uncommon. But these are mutations that occur in families with almost 100% penetrance. It's like Huntington's disease. It's very uncommon. The most common genetic thing that would affect a lot of people is a gene called apolipoprotein E. And there's 3 different variations, 2, 3, and 4, apolipoprotein E 2, 3, and 4. And it's the apolipoprotein E4 allele, if you will, that is the major genetic risk factor for the common late onset Alzheimer's disease. Everyone has 2 copies, right? And so if you have a single copy of ApoE4, it doubles to triples your risk of developing Alzheimer's disease in life. And its prevalence in the population is about 25%. So about a quarter of everyone walking around has 1 or 2 copies of this gene. So that's the major genetic risk factor that you need to think about. Having said that, there's nothing you can do about your genetics. They are what they are, right?
Right.
The biggest risk factor, by far and away, the elephant in the room, is age. There's nothing you could do about age.
Yeah, for sure.
You are whatever your age is. That's what you are, and you hope you make it to the next year. So, but by far and away, the biggest risk factor for dementia is simply old age. Again, there's no cure for old age. It is what it is. Age, the effect of old age is much bigger than the effect of apolipoprotein E. So it's just living a long time dramatically increases your risk. So you can't do anything about genetics. You can't do anything about whatever your age is in terms of lifestyle modifications. But there are some things that you can do that decrease the likelihood that you'll start losing cells, that you protect your brain, basically. It may not surprise anyone to hear that a lot of the things that protect your brain, that you can do to protect your brain, are the same sorts of things that you hear to protect your heart. So remember that one of the major contributors to dementia is not Alzheimer's disease, but it's small strokes. And so what are the kind of things that you can do to lessen the likelihood that you'll get these small strokes? One is exercise. Well-designed exercise program. It elevates your heart rate and includes all the normal things that exercise physiologists will tell you to do, include strength training, flexibility, etc. That can protect your brain. And that's one of the things you can do to reduce the likelihood of dementia. Another thing is keep your weight down. So being normal weight as opposed to obese will protect your brain. Another thing is good diet. So eating a lousy diet increases your likelihood of small strokes. Eat a good diet. Another thing is to make sure that medical conditions that you have are properly managed. If you have hypertension, keep your blood pressure under control. Take your medicines on a regular basis.
Right.
Same with type 2 diabetes.
Mm-hmm.
There are certain heart conditions like atrial fibrillation is a common thing that occurs in older people, and it is a common cause of strokes. If you have atrial fibrillation, make sure you are closely monitored by your doctor and take your medicine on time and on a regular basis. When I was doing my medical training, the number one thing that general practitioner docs that would, you would do preceptorships would complain about, to be honest with you, is lack of compliance among patients. So a patient would be diagnosed as hypertensive, they'd be given a prescription for medicines, and lo and behold, they wouldn't take their medicines.
Right.
So, taking care of your heart is also taking care of your brain.
Okay.
And another thing that is important, and it's hard to see what the biological link would be, but the data is incontrovertible, and that is social engagement and making sure you have a purpose. So as people age, it's easy to see how people become more socially isolated. A lot of family and friends, people start dying, right? So people become more and more isolated. And that is bad for you. It probably is the case that as one becomes more socially isolated, just the will to take care of your health every day dwindles away.
Right.
You just care less and less.
Right.
And it's caring less and less about your health that is deadly for your brain as you get older. I mean, and another thing very much related to social engagement is making sure that you have a purpose in life. I think they're one and the same.
Right.
But when people, talk about retirement, the last thing you want to do is retire from work where you've been engaged in something that gave you a daily purpose.
Right.
And go from that to sitting around watching TV all day with nothing to do.
Good point.
It's deadly. So it's hard to know what the biological link is between social engagement and maintaining a purpose in life, being healthy. But my take on it is by being engaged with something outside of yourself,
Right.
you take better care of yourself. And
For sure.
taking better care of yourself that is important for your mental health, for the health of your brain. In summary, there's certain things that you can't do anything about in terms of lowering your risk of becoming demented.
Right.
How old you are, your genetics, that is what it is.
Mm-hmm.
But there are a number of different aspects of daily life that you can pay close attention to, work at, that can lower your risk of ever developing dementia considerably. I think that would be a good take-home message for people.
I like that, to continue to find the purpose in which you were meant for in this life.
Yeah. I mean, not only does it make life more pleasant, but it's good for the health of your brain.
Yeah, exactly. Can I ask you too, Cliff, what factors influence the choice of treatment for individual patients?
Yeah, so let's confine ourselves to Alzheimer's disease. I think it's
okay.
I think it's simpler to talk about that. So the 4 big disease categories that are ultimately causal for dementia: Alzheimer's disease, 1; Lewy body disease, which is the same pathology that causes Parkinson's disease; vascular disease, and then the TDP-43. So let's just take TDP-43 off the table. I mean, there's no known treatment, there's no definitive diagnosis for it, but we know it happens in a lot of people because it's seen at autopsy. But so there's nothing really there. The choice of treatment for vascular problems, it's really exactly the same as the treatment for heart disease. Whatever your risk factor is, that risk factor should be treated to the maximum ability that medicine has. So if you've got hypertension, you and your doctor need to work until sometimes it takes a combination. Sometimes one drug doesn't work, but another one will. Combinations are often necessary, etc. You have to work with your doc until you have that under control. If it's type 2 diabetes, again, very, very often a cocktail of drugs is what you need, but you need to get your blood sugar under control. If it's weight management, you got to get that under control. So it's whatever cocktail or whatever approach is needed to get the vascular risk factor that you have, whether it's obesity, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, atrial fibrillation, get that under control. So that's for the vascular component of this. For the Lewy body component, until very recently, the treatments are very much like Alzheimer's disease. You can treat the symptoms, so you can give people drugs that will make their tremor less, make their gait more normal, but it doesn't change the underlying progression of the disease.
Okay.
But still, people should treat the symptoms. And now we come to Alzheimer's disease. And as we said earlier, until very recently, you could take a pill or pills, might brighten up your affect a little bit, but they wouldn't change in any way the underlying progression of the disease. Now that's all changed. Reality is the treatment is going to be monoclonal antibodies. It requires infusions twice a week. Right now, it's possible that subcutaneous injections will be possible, but right now, the treatment would involve biweekly infusions. So it's very intensive, and only certain people would be eligible on the basis of what was shown to be beneficial in the clinical trials. These are very early days. So these treatments have not yet kind of been rolled out in general medicine, but it's anticipated that they will over the next year or two. And certain classes of people who meet certain criteria, i.e. people who are really going to benefit, are going to be then eligible for these kinds of treatments.
Oh, that's amazing. And how can loved ones help their loved ones who are suffering with this disease? What things can loved ones do?
Yeah, that's a great question. As you said when you were talking about your grandma, I mean, dementia is not a disease that just affects the patient. Of course, it affects the patient, but it affects the friends and family, and in particular, it affects the caregiver.
Yes.
Once someone the definition of dementia is that a person's cognitive abilities have declined so much that they can't care for themselves anymore. That means they've become dependent on a caretaker or caretakers, which are very often family members.
Yeah.
So what can you do to help a caretaker? One thing is to recognize that it's extremely hard work. It's draining. And so anything that you as a friend or family member of a caretaker can do to relieve that is going to be very beneficial. If you can watch the patient, give the caretaker a break, a day off. If you can take over some of the responsibilities, keeping track of financial stuff so that the caretaker doesn't have to do that in addition to watching the patient. If you can arrange for home health care several times a week to give the caretaker a break, or if just other family members can rotate in and give the primary caretaker a break. All of these things are beneficial because being a caretaker, like I said, is extremely draining on the caretaker. And the more you can relieve that person, the better it'll be for the caretaker. And the happier the caretaker is, the happier the patient will be.
And as you were talking, I thought about, are there any resources that you know about? You know, we live in this mecca of healthcare, right? Where everything is at our disposal if we need, especially in the town in which we live. Do you know if there are any resources available to help people cope with the challenges of, this condition, especially if they live in underserved communities?
Yeah. So underserved communities, there's a second meaning to underserved communities that people often don't recognize, and that is people who live in rural areas.
Yeah.
People who live, out in the middle of nowhere have nothing. They have
Yeah.
but it is the case that two things. So every patient, every family should have a primary care doctor, and that primary care doctor should serve as the resource for helping with these kinds of problems. There are agencies, home health care agencies. There are many home health care agencies, probably even serving rural areas, although it's much tougher in rural areas than it is in cities. Find good home health care.
Yeah.
But home health care is really an important component of managing kinds of situations, because people can stay in their own homes. Most patients would prefer to stay in their own homes as long as they can, and engaging the services of home health care can really extend that period of time quite a bit.
Okay.
In addition to the primary care doc, though, the Alzheimer's Association, the U.S. Alzheimer's Association, one of the major functions of the Alzheimer's Association, and I don't work for the Alzheimer's Association, but disclosure, I'm heavily involved with the mission of the Alzheimer's Association and with the Alzheimer's Association itself. I work for the Mayo Clinic, but for disclosure purposes. But one of the missions of the Alzheimer's Association is exactly this. It's education and it's outreach to people, to help people families who have this kind of issue going on, find the resources that they can call on to help out the family. So a call to the local chapter of the Alzheimer's Association is something that people can do. And every state or states has an Alzheimer's Association branch.
Okay.
So call to the Alzheimer's Association to find resources. Social worker, home health care, etc. People should really use these kinds of resources as much as possible. And these sorts of resources, the home health care and social workers will help the family. It becomes impossible to keep the patient at home. They just become too impaired. They can't, even with a family member as a primary caregiver, they just can't stay in their home anymore. And it happens to a lot of people.
Right.
Then it's time to look at memory care. And then from memory care, there are progressive facilities that take care of people with greater and greater impairment. But the first step from home would be memory care. And a social worker and the Alzheimer's Association and home health care people, professionals who work in this area all the time, can help family navigate this first step from home to memory care, which is oftentimes a very painful thing. Patients almost always do not want to go from home to memory care, but at some point it becomes necessary. And so the professionals in this area can help families navigate that step.
Thank you for all of the information, Cliff, that you shared, where people can find resources. And as you were talking about, sometimes the initial caregiver may need, people to come in and step in and help them carry that burden as well. One beautiful memory that I have that I will share with you as well is that when my Nana was living with this disease, my aunt was the initial caregiver, as well as my grandfather and my mom. So my mom would come, to her house every day to help, lessen the burden from my grandfather and from my aunt. And then I had cousins, and my godmother would come and help lessen the burden. So it was just in the midst of this horrible experience, watching someone that you love decline. We had people who would come in and out, to help. But the beautiful memory that I wanted to share with you was that a month before my grandma transitioned, it was my aunt, myself, and my Nana. And at this point in my Nana's journey, she needed 24-hour care. And she couldn't at this point remember how to walk. So she was basically in a wheelchair. But the surprising thing is that sometimes she would just get out of her wheelchair and she would walk over to the door, and you might find her just standing at the doorway, watching and waving to the neighbors as they would come by her house. And we would say, Nana, what are you doing? But she would just look out the window and just like wave to the people. And I'd be like, I don't know how she did it, but she did it. But there was one moment where it was my Nana, my aunt, and myself, and in the bathroom. And my aunt was helping my Nana. And my aunt says, Mom, do you know who this is? And my Nana looked at me, and I could tell by her eyes that she knew exactly who I was, but she couldn't get the thoughts or the words to like say. And my aunt said, do you know her name? So we were in the bathroom now. It's like going on 20 minutes, 30 minutes. And we're just sitting there and we're just talking. And all of a sudden, my grandma looked at me and she said, Trina. And I thought, Nana, you do know who I am. And I think it's one thing that this disease has taught me is that you have to love people where they are. And you have to be grateful for all of the moments that come and go. Some of them may be fleeting, but you have to, because each of these moments are precious. Life is precious. And, I think about all the people that I've known throughout my life who maybe had some form of this disease, but didn't have the resources or the wherewithal to know exactly what they were going through. And, some people thought, oh, they're just losing their mind. And I think if we could only just love people where they are and try our best to be there for them, that could make a difference. All of this information that you've shared with me today, Cliff, I know that there are so many other listeners out there who will find value. And before we conclude, I want to ask you, Cliff, what hobbies do you partake in? But what things do you do for yourself to give you that peace in your life?
Good question. So I have two. I have one common hobby, and that is exercise.
Uh-huh.
So,
Love it.
Yeah, you and I share the exercise class, and I commute to work on my bicycle when the weather permits.
Mm-hmm.
In Minnesota, it doesn't permit in January and February, but but that's another thing. I mean,
Right.
it could drive a car, but
Right.
exercise. You get a little exercise riding a bike. So exercise is one hobby.
Mm-hmm.
Then the other thing I do, you mentioned at the beginning, is I've been actually a professional musician since I was a teenager.
Mm-hmm.
It's a hobby I have. I've just kept it up, and I've kept it up over all the years. It's something I enjoy. And bass player Bob Gardner is the bass player's name. He's a local teacher to secondary school, and he and I played at this place called the Redwood Room in town in Rochester here. It's a restaurant for, I'm going to say, 30 years.
Oh my goodness, Cliff.
So twice a month,
Wow.
The management has kept us playing there for twice a month. For 30 years, we play jazz standards, improvisation. It's a great hobby. I think unless you have a lot of talent, being a professional performing musician is a tough life.
Yeah.
And not being in possession of a lot of talent.
Oh, come on.
It still is a great hobby, and I recommend it to anyone. But I think you have to be Wynton Marsalis. If you've got Wynton Marsalis level of talent, then you're set. If you're just an ordinary guy like me, it's best to have it as a hobby, not a profession.
Cliff, what instrument do you play?
I play guitar.
I love it.
My idol growing up was Wes Montgomery.
Wow.
Any budding jazz guitarists who want to know where to start listening for jazz guitar, you can start with the Wes Montgomery library. You can't go wrong.
Can I ask you, Wes Montgomery is in jazz, But
Mhm.
what are some of your other favorite genres or styles of music?
To be honest with you, that's really what I like. I
Okay.
like, yeah, I mean, they're all different styles of jazz, right? There's
Yeah.
bebop, which Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, Bud Powell. So that's kind of bebop. I like that. And then there's styles that came after that, which you would be popularized by people like, these names aren't going to be familiar, but they're to the average person, but they're very familiar to people in jazz. So the kind of groups that were led by Art Blakey, Art
Okay.
Blakey and the Jazz Messengers. So when I was young, I also played trumpet. So
Wow.
my, the people that I really listened to were, virtuoso trumpet players, jazz trumpet players like Clifford Brown and Freddie Hubbard
Okay.
and Woody Shaw. So those were, people I listened to a lot. Then even the more kind of modern styles, exemplified by people like John Coltrane and Miles
Yeah.
Davis and Wayne Shorter. That's the kind of stuff that I enjoy listening to. And all these names that I've just rattled off, I mean, they are household names to anyone who knows anything about jazz, but they're some of the names are familiar to the average person. But I mean, all these people that I've just talked about were just, enormously talented people who still listen to all the time.
Yeah, I love it. Now, listeners, you can see why Cliff and I are workout buddies. And you can also see the person who inhabits the research space, like Dr. Cliff Jack, like the person that you have heard from today who does all of this amazing research, who also is an outstanding, he will say that he is not, but he is an outstanding guitarist as well. But Dr. Cliff is also just an outstanding, in my opinion, human being. I would like to leave off today by saying a quote from Dostoevsky. The mystery of human existence lies not in just staying alive, but in finding something to live for. In other words, the purpose of life is a life of purpose. If we know why we are here, if we have a reason for our existence, we feel more connected and more alive. When I think of the insights and the contributions that Dr. Cliff Jack has been doing in advancing our understanding and treatment of Alzheimer's and dementia, his work continues to inspire and inform researchers and healthcare professionals the world over. I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, Dr. Cliff. Thank you for sharing your insights, spending this time with us today on this podcast.
Well, Trina, thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to share what little I know with your listeners, and I'm delighted to work through this with a friend.
Thank you, my friend. I appreciate you. I really do.
The feeling's mutual, and I won't see you tomorrow. I've got something, I got a conflict at work. Wednesday, bright and early, we'll be back in the exercise class.
Okay, see you on Wednesday, Cliff. Blocks
All right.
3 and 4.
It sounds good.
God bless you, my friend.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. You too.